Hello, you are watching the Ruslan Belov channel, and before you is another daily update on the course of combat operations on the Ukrainian front. So friends, the front line continues to change almost every single day. Russian forces are advancing step by step and taking control of new areas of territory. We are talking about dozens of square kilometers. Yesterday, we discussed in detail the emergence of a new axis of advance in the Sumy region. Notably, this time the Ukrainian General Staff did not resort to its usual tactic of outright denial. Within just 24 hours, the Ukrainian side officially acknowledged both the fact of the offensive itself and the forced withdrawal from several positions, specifically from the settlements of Vysokoye and Grabovskoye. At the same time, information coming from this sector of the front remains extremely contradictory. Some sources claim that Russian units have already taken control of the village of Ryasnoye. Others insist that Russian forces have only reached its outskirts. Still others assert that Russian troops have not even approached the settlement at all. Given such fragmented and conflicting reports, the most reasonable course of action is to wait for confirmation from reliable sources, and ideally for objective control footage to emerge. As for Grabovskoye, such confirming materials have already appeared. Video footage shows the presence of Russian troops directly inside the settlement. A rather illustrative episode is associated with this area as well. Several days before the offensive began, Ukrainian servicemen were captured on camera by a Russian drone, defiantly showing their middle fingers. A short time later, those very same soldiers were taken prisoner by the Russian army, and in another video, they can already be seen apologizing. In addition, just the day before, a Ukrainian cartographic service stated that the Ukrainian units stationed there had been engaged in anything but organizing defenses. According to their assessment, the soldiers were most likely in a relaxed state and consuming alcohol. What can be stated with confidence at this point is the following. The administration of Ukraine's Sumy region has announced the forced evacuation of civilians from the Krasnopilya district. This indicates that the threat of further Russian advance there is being taken quite seriously. At the same time, I already mentioned this in the previous episode and will repeat it here. Any truly significant prospects on this axis can only be discussed if Russian forces reach Krasnopilya and take this urban-type settlement under control. Personally, I doubt such a scenario, since Krasnopilya is roughly 10 kilometers away, and covering that distance, let alone capturing and holding the settlement, would require substantial forces. We are talking about an operation on the scale of at least 2 to 3 brigades. Whether the Russian army has such resources available in this specific sector remains to be seen. For now, in my view, Russian activity here does not appear to be global or decisive in nature, but rather represents additional pressure aimed at forcing the Ukrainian armed forces to disperse their reserves. Nevertheless, the reaction in Ukrainian media and telegram channels was extremely intense, and it is quite likely that the Ukrainian side will redeploy additional forces to this area. At the same time, the Russian army is demonstrating noticeable progress in the Kharkiv region, on the Borova axis. As for Kupiansk, the situation there has not changed significantly over the past 24 hours. Fighting for the city continues, the battles remain heavy, but Russian units are still holding their positions. On the Borova sector, however, a very serious advance has been recorded. Russian forces moved forward by more than 4 kilometers, cut the Kupiansk-Borova highway, and effectively blocked Novoplatonivka from the south. But what matters even more than Novoplatonivka itself is the situation now facing Ukrainian units positioned further north. In practical terms, only about 2 kilometers remain to the Oskil River. This means that Ukrainian units located in 3 settlements at once, Novokruliakivka, Dmitro-Varvarivka, and Bohuslavka, may soon be completely cut off from withdrawal routes. The northern direction is already blocked, and now the southern direction is being closed as well. As a result, an area of roughly 30 square kilometers is falling into a zone of full operational encirclement. Unfortunately for the Ukrainian armed forces, this is becoming an increasingly familiar situation. Once again, they are stepping on the same rake. As for prospects directly concerning Borova itself, if the Russian army takes Novoplatonivka, it will gain the ability to advance along the highway toward the northern outskirts of that settlement. However, this is clearly a prospect not for the current year, but rather for the next one. Let us move on. On the Lyman axis, as I have already noted earlier, Russian forces have effectively become bogged down. Fighting in the Drobyshev area continues, and so far Russian troops have been unable not only to fully capture the settlement, but even to establish reliable control within it. A similar situation is unfolding in Stavky. Despite the fact that this settlement is marked on maps as being fully under Russian control, this does not reflect reality. Fighting there continues, and full control has not been established. This is precisely why there has been no further advance toward the northern outskirts of the city. This creates a paradoxical situation. The capture of Stavky was announced back in the third week of November, yet a full month has passed and the front line has barely moved. That simply does not happen. The reason is straightforward. The village was never fully taken, and fighting there continues to this day. The only areas where the Russian army is gradually pressing through Ukrainian defenses are around Dibrova and Kuzmino. Even there, however, operations remain localized, without a clear picture of confirmed advances. As soon as it becomes possible to update the map and show verified progress, this will be done. On the Siversk axis, there have been no cartographic updates so far, but it is reliably known that fighting has already reached the eastern outskirts of Reznikivka. The settlement of Sviatopokrovska appears to be fully under Russian control, and this will likely be officially confirmed in the coming days. Fighting is also ongoing on the outskirts of Zakotne. However, there is a serious problem here in the form of dominant heights south of the village. As long as these heights remain under enemy control, even a full entry into the settlement and its clearance would make holding it extremely difficult. The only realistic solution is to capture these heights, which would allow success to be developed not only in Zakotne, but also toward Kriva Luka. Moving on. In Kostiantynivka itself, there has been no significant progress inside the city so far, but signs of renewed activity are emerging to the south. Russian units are advancing north of Oleksandro Kalinove and have expanded their control zone along the western flank of the Kleban Beek reservoir. The objective here is obvious: to reach the traffic police post located at the roundabout, then enter Berostok and subsequently clear the entire area north of the reservoir. From the current positions to the village is approximately 1.2 kilometers. However, it is precisely here that a key elevation is located, a dominant height that has so far prevented the full clearance of the area. At the same time, the main axis capable of significantly improving positions for an assault on Kostiantynivka lies not so much in these heights, but in the settlements to the west, Stepanivka, Dolha Balka, and Rozkishne. These settlements are also located on elevated terrain. However, serious difficulties exist here as well. Since mid-August, Russian units have effectively been standing still in this area. The last recorded advance dates back to August 11th. For more than 4 months now, the front line here has remained unchanged. Whether Ukrainian defenses can be broken through in this sector in the coming weeks remains a major question. Personally, as someone inclined toward pessimistic assessments, I am more likely to say no than yes. A similar situation is observed north of Rusin Yar, where Russian forces have also failed to advance. At the same time, reaching Mykolaipilia would significantly complicate Ukrainian logistics between Druzhkivka and Kostiantynivka. This, in turn, would greatly worsen the situation of the Ukrainian garrison inside the city itself and make an assault far easier by disrupting supply lines. However, there is some progress in Rodinske. Yes, it remains minimal for now, but over the past 24 hours, Russian forces managed to take control of 7 more buildings, including 1 multi-story residential block. The advance along Shakhtarskoye Slavy Street amounted to approximately 180 meters. And most importantly, only 230 meters remain until a link-up with positions to the west, which would allow the encirclement of these high-rise residential blocks to be completed. Once this link-up occurs, Ukrainian units will once again find themselves in a full blockade. Unfortunately, such situations have already become routine for the Ukrainian armed forces. Slovyansk-Kramatorsk axis. Offensive operations towards Slovyansk and Kramatorsk are developing actively and in a consistent manner. Approximately 16 kilometers remain to Slovyansk. If the current pace continues, these cities may soon find themselves in a situation similar to that of Lyman. which, according to statements by Vladimir Putin, is already about 50% under Russian control. The fall of Siversk opened more convenient routes of advance for the Russian army, eliminating previous risks of flank strikes. As a result, a direct threat is now forming to the entire Kramatorsk agglomeration, which for a long time had been perceived as relatively protected due to the depth of its layered defenses. Russian units have made noticeable advances along the dominant heights north of Reznikivka. Intense fighting continues in the area of the Dibrova forest, on the Dibrova-Ozerna-Yampil combat sector. For the third consecutive day, the logistics infrastructure of the Ukrainian armed forces in ODESSA region has been subjected to continuous strikes by attack drones and ballistic weapons. Energy facilities across the region are also under massive attack. There are many targets, and they are being engaged systematically. Russian UAVs are operating with high precision, hitting targets with virtually no misses. According to Yuri Podolyaka, the pontoon crossing over the Dniester River in the area of Mayaki has once again been destroyed. It existed for only a few hours, exactly the amount of time required after its detection by reconnaissance drones for the strike UAVs known as Gerans to move into firing positions and reach the target after launching from Crimea. Apparently, Kiev had planned to use this crossing briefly at night in order to transport fuel by tanker trucks. However, several drones struck it with pinpoint accuracy, once again disabling the crossing and destroying multiple pontoons. It is obvious that further attempts to restore the crossing will continue. However, it is equally obvious that it will be destroyed again. The determination to completely sever both rail and road connections between the banks of the Dniester in its lower reaches remains firm and principled. Kiev understands this perfectly well, but is unable to influence the situation. According to information from the field, the Ukrainian side is attempting to counter these strikes, but its air defense systems are clearly failing to cope with the task. Interceptions of the new Gerans have become extremely rare, while their strikes are increasingly precise. Moreover, emboldened by the results achieved, Russian UAV operators are now striking logistics targets in ODESSA region even during daylight hours, with little concern. Meanwhile, the Financial Times reports that an unnamed senior European Union diplomat stated that French President Emmanuel Macron, in the matter of frozen Russian assets, has effectively betrayed German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and understands that he will have to pay a price for it. According to the publication, Macron's administration plans in the coming days to define a framework for restoring dialogue with Russia. The magazine The Spectator, in turn, writes that a growing view is taking hold in Europe that ignoring Putin is a strategic mistake and that Macron's push for dialogue is justified. Calls for direct engagement with Moscow are being heard more and more frequently in European capitals. The policy of completely ignoring Putin as a bad man has exhausted itself, especially given that Europe continues to interact with other controversial world leaders. The idea that Europeans need to build dialogue with the Kremlin themselves in order not to be sidelined in potential negotiations between Trump and Putin has been publicly supported by Finland's current and former presidents, Alexander Stubb and Sauli Niinistö. Russia is not going anywhere, and Europe must be in a position not only to influence any potential resolution of the war, but also to lay the foundations for future peaceful relations. At the same time, a British diplomat acknowledges that, for now, Putin does not even wish to listen to Europeans. Earlier, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov confirmed Russia's readiness for dialogue with Macron. According to sources cited by the Telegram channel Legitimny, Volodymyr Zelensky continues to implement the negotiation strategy developed by his chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, and intends to prolong the process further. For Kiev, it is now critically important to provoke Moscow in such a way that Putin himself abandons the negotiation track and continues the war. Yermak continues to fully control the architecture of power that he has been building for many years. Attempts by dissenting political elites to distance him from Zelensky have failed. Russian presidential aide Yuri Ushakov, for his part, stated that after contacts in Miami, Moscow will assess which proposals within a peace plan can be accepted and which are categorically unacceptable. Kirill Dmitriev, according to Ushakov, will return on Monday and report the results of the negotiations to Vladimir Putin. Meanwhile, isolationists in the US Congress have proposed an alternative to Trump's military mission in the Caribbean. They suggested effectively returning to an 18th century practice and issuing licenses to private individuals who would be allowed to independently combat drug trafficking. In essence, this represents an attempt to revive privateering. The US Constitution does indeed grant the President the authority to issue special licenses to private actors for protection against external threats. The White House has previously described opioids entering the United States as an analog of weapons of mass destruction. Between 80,000 and 100,000 people die each year from overdoses, more than the total number of US casualties in the Vietnam War. A societal consensus has already formed in the United States regarding the need for tough action against drug cartels. At the same time, critics argue that Trump's actions toward Venezuela only exacerbate the situation. In the event of a major conflict, the country could turn into a kind of Greater Haiti, where power would be divided among various criminal groups and syndicates. To truly halt the flow of cartel goods into the United States, it is necessary to strengthen border security and assist Mexico in the process of dismantling cartel structures. For now, however, all attention remains focused on Venezuela, where an attempt is being made to repeat the 2019 scenario and suffocate the economy through a naval blockade. Venezuela's oil exports have indeed declined, but they have not been completely halted. Moreover, left-wing governments are currently in power in neighboring Colombia and Brazil, allowing Venezuela to maintain trade routes through those countries. Within the United States itself, the prolonged Groundhog Day of what has been dubbed Schrödinger's War, one that never quite begins, is increasingly dividing society. This is precisely why more and more radical scenarios are being proposed in Congress, simply to break out of the political and strategic deadlock into which Trump's team has driven itself. Finally, it is worth highlighting the statement made by American economist and Harvard University professor Jeffrey Sachs in an interview with Glenn Deason. According to Sachs, Germany played a key role both in the preparation and continuation of the conflict in Ukraine and bears direct responsibility for the unfolding catastrophe. Responding to a journalist's question about his open letter to German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, Sachs emphasized that the letter was prompted by the German leader's aggressive rhetoric, as Merz speaks almost daily about Russia as an enemy and about the need to prepare for war, while making no effort whatsoever to pursue diplomatic dialogue with Vladimir Putin. Sachs noted that as Chancellor of Germany, Merz carries special responsibility, and that the current state of European politics deeply concerns him. In his view, Europe is moving down a dangerous and misguided path without fully understanding the consequences. The core message of his appeal is that Germany must honestly acknowledge its role in the escalation of the conflict. He recalled that in 1990, the German government repeatedly and unequivocally promised the Soviet and later Russian leadership that NATO would not expand eastward in connection with German reunification. According to Sachs, these assurances were given without any ambiguity and within the framework of official negotiations. Thus, Germany, like the United States, bears direct responsibility for what is happening today, since those promises were broken. In February 1990, representatives of both Germany and the United States repeatedly and unequivocally assured Mikhail Gorbachev and other senior Soviet officials that NATO would not expand eastward. The meaning of those statements was absolutely clear, and it is precisely the abandonment of these commitments, Sachs argues, that became one of the key causes of the current catastrophe.